Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the planet. I think I'm slightly deaf in this ear because when the music kicked in, it was a lot louder than I expected. And as you can see, this is kind of a very sparse setup. For me, I haven't got the microphone or the lights or anything because I am in Cyprus. And so I'm traveling again, and more about that in a moment. But John, I believe you're back home now, and Diane, you're no longer with us in
Yes,
the UK.
after
You're back home as
2000,
well.
after 2,000 kilometers of driving, I'm back home and feeling like I've driven 2,000 kilometers. Diane?
Well, after 30 hours of flying, I'm definitely feeling like I've been flying for 30 hours.
It's good stuff. Well, it's good to praise the Lord that we've been kept safe in all of the travels, and he's brought some of us home, and hopefully I can get home safe next week. But Sam, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm the only one who hasn't gone anywhere, so that's great. I've just been sat working here. But my new job's going really well, making some really good connections, and hopefully, we'll be able to use the company to help creation research in the future in
Wonderful.
some regard.
That's what we want. That's what we want. Excellent stuff.
And
Well,
Craig, by the
let's.
way, I better tell
Oh,
you where
go on.
he
Yes.
is. He's on the west coast of Tasmania, and he'll be at a church near an old mining town this weekend, which conveniently is in the same place where they're having a big gem show this weekend. So that's where Craig is, long way away from any sort of decent communications or whatever. Tasmania is not a very populated place anyway, and the west coast is not populated because it's mostly rain for most of the days of the year. In fact, some of the early government settlements were abandoned because they were just simply too wet. So Craig's away from us today. He'll be back next week.
Great stuff. And I know that many of these people who are involved in these gem shows are also into the fossily side of things as well. So it'll be interesting to see what Craig sees there. Why don't we go around and do a quick ministry update then, what people have been doing and so on and so forth over the last little while. I know that we've all been on the road. And Diane, I know you're bringing us some presentations later. And John, you've got our main topic for tonight. Once I've done my update section, I've got a little video for you to watch, and we'll talk more about what I've been doing later. But I'm actually going to drop out after sort of 30 minutes or so, mainly because even though my little laptop clock down here says it's just turned 9 o'clock in the evening, the reality is my phone, which is keyed into local time zone, is 11 o'clock. So it's actually at the time which we would normally be finishing in the UK. And we've just about adjusted to the time difference, so we'd like to keep it that way. So I'm going to drop off after about 30 minutes or so, after we've given you an update and a little bit of a presentation. But we'll have some questions, then I'll leave, and it'll be over to the rest of the team to carry us through till the end. But John, what have you been doing over the last little while? Because between the open day that we had 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, quite a while ago now, we've barely spoken because you've been out in the bush, I've been out, I went away and busy and everything. So what have you been up to?
Well, I'll show you the most exciting things I brought back with me, and we'll save our PowerPoints for the main part of the presentation after Diane's update. I have with me for our museum collection a nice polished section of well, Joe, you should recognize that. What is it?
I'm in two minds. It's either a stromatolite or it's a stalactite segment.
Right. It's a good stalactite center, and you can see
Stalactite,
the
yeah.
rings there that are
Yeah,
usually
that's
used
what
for
threw me.
dating them. So this is from an old collection because obviously getting many of the big stalactites in the caves is now illegal, so we don't do that. But this is a beautifully polished section, and one intended for a bit of research because you see some black rings in the stalactites. They are full of carbon and potentially datable using carbon 14 and things like that. You know, the standard story that the stalactites take vast ages to grow. And you know, at Jurassic Ark, we've been showing that they simply don't take that. They don't take time. They take a process. We've also brought back one of these. Look at that beautiful banded. It's not agate. It's a big Mexican calcite, not long ago discovered. We've managed to get ourselves a beautiful couple of specimens of it. You can see the layers. Well, in creation research, we're very fascinated with layers. This is the first time we come across it this marked in calcite, calcium carbonate, the same stuff you find in stalactites. So that's, again, a research project. What's the black doing? Is it traces of petroleum? All those sort of things we'll be researching. And, of course, we also brought back with us some nice specimens, a bit hard to see because they're faint. These are about up to 2 inches long, 4 or 5 centimeters long. And what you find is they're giant copepods. Now, the reason I got those out is that last night for Family Devotions, we had a little article, and it was all about a outbreak of what's that disease you get from swallowing copepods, Diane? You're
Cholera.
our experts.
Sorry,
Where have you
cholera.
gone? Oh, cholera, that's right. And I was reminded of these because you and I have done quite a few programs on disease, and copepods feature quite markedly. And my grandson, who was with us last night, we discussed how you get typhoid and cholera. And the cholera one particularly in London in the 1800s, they had a serious outbreak and they couldn't figure out what was causing it. And of course, it's really due to the effluent getting into the water. The effluent, of course, makes so much fertility in the water that the algae and everything that the copepods eat grows really strong, and they grow crazily. And then the actual disease comes from getting too many of those in your stomach. So you'll find that the copepods used to be much bigger. So let me hold it up again. You'd notice very markedly if you swallowed some of those, but copepods, like many things, used to be much bigger, and now they're just tiny, not quite microscopic, about the size of a grain of rice sometimes, usually smaller, but they used to be giants, and now they're much smaller than that. And of course, later on in the ministry update, I'll be actually giving you, so we can talk about it, some of our experiments that we've been doing and running homeschooling conferences that are really about Jurassic Ark in miniature, how to experiment to show this principle, not time but process. So that's sort of the things that I've been doing over the last 2,000 kilometers. If I look like I've got rings under my eyes, yes, some of you know my poor wife has not been too well, so now she's not allowed to drive, and all the driving is up to me. Joseph's got the opposite. He's got his license back after being sick last year, and now his wife Sarah is rejoicing that he's allowed to drive, and so are we. But it's been a great couple of weeks away. Missed you guys, but I couldn't even get you. On one place I was at, you had to stand beside a metal pole and poke your phone to the northeast, and you finally got a tiny 2-bar signal, and that was the best I could do. So I would have hated to try FaceTime and things like that on it. So over to you, Diane.
Yes, well, I'm a bit phased looking as well. I've been flying for 30 hours. I've been back for a day, but it seems to have disappeared in a sort of fog. So yes, I've come back to Australia from the UK. I had a wonderful time in the UK, and I'm looking forward to going back if the Lord enables, because there's lots of interesting things to do. We had a really good time at the museum when I stayed with Joseph and Sarah Ann, and we did all sorts of interesting things and had a fabulous open day that you heard about last week. And plus there are other things that I can do as well. The last week after I left Oswestry, I went to London, and as usual, I always go to the Natural History Museum and Kew Gardens, so I've got a bit to show you about that later on. And I know a couple of people in some small churches there who are faithfully teaching creation in spite of the fact of being surrounded by so much liberal theology in London and in the UK in general. So I was able to spend a bit of time with them, and I gave a presentation to a kids and youth group on the 6 days of creation, which they really enjoyed, and I've been invited back, so I'd certainly be happy to come back and another small church runs a program called Jesus in Everything, which is what we believe as well. And they did a program called Jesus in Science last year, which I was part of. And hopefully I'll be able to be part of that again next year. But anyway, we shall see what the Lord enables. But I really did have a wonderful time. And I'd like to thank all of the people, the creation research supporters and various other people, some I know who watched this live stream, for the really good time of fellowship that I had and really good time of support. And hopefully I'll get to see you in person again sometime. But from in between, it has to be online. But praise the Lord for online while we've got it.
It's it's never ideal online stuff, online ministry, but it really has opened up the world like we never thought it would before. I mean, we're coming up not too far off 2 years of creation conversations, so praise the Lord for that, and may that be many more years to come. In fact, we were just discussing before we started about some of the future and some of the plans and projects, and we've got a lot of things in the works, not just for creation conversations, but also for future documentaries and for future programs and stuff like that. And yes, John mentioned that I have my driver's license back. And for those who don't know, I didn't do anything wrong, don't worry. Basically, over a year and a half ago, more than that now, actually, I had a bit of a collapse. If you go back through Creation Conversations, we did a little update about what was happening with me at the time. And the end result of that was that I lost my license due to medical reasons, even though I'd had letters through from the doctor saying that I'm fine. And they were initially worried that there was something wrong with my heart. And there isn't. So praise the Lord for that, first and foremost. But basically, it took about 8 months between them saying that I'm fine to trying to convince the driving authorities that I was allowed to actually drive. But now I am allowed to drive again. So, do you know what I think we're due? We're due a good Indiana Jones road trip at some point soon, probably going up north to Whitby and round there this time. So stay tuned for that and for many other things that we have as well. If I dive in there, guys, and do my little segment, I want to start with reading a section from Scripture, because, as I said, we are in Cyprus at the moment. And basically what had happened was back 2020, all the COVID stuff, I was in the States. We had to rush back home, book new flights. We had to get other flights that we'd had booked reimbursed and so on and so forth. Somewhere around there, and we still haven't quite worked out where, but somewhere around there, we ended up getting some reimbursement of some vouchers from British Airways, which they kindly informed me just a few weeks ago and said you had to book by the end of September. So they didn't give us very long to sort anything out. So we decided to have a bit of a break. It's been a pretty hectic year for me and for my wife, Sarah Ann. So we decided we needed a bit of a break, took the opportunity to go to Cyprus. We were sort of limited on where we could go because of it being British Airways and where they go this time of year. But I have to admit, I have properly fallen in love with Cyprus. It is an amazing place. The archaeology is just unbelievable. It's literally everywhere you go, everywhere you turn, there are monuments, there are ruins, there are archaeological stuff, and it's very, very different from the kind of archaeological stuff that you get here in the UK. It's a very different philosophy. So here, you go to some old Roman ruins and it's English heritage, don't touch the walls, don't climb on the walls, barricades up everywhere. Here it's sort of like, well, if you want to reach anything, you have to climb on the walls. They're almost encouraging you, right, to kind of go and clamber over and see what you can discover and see what you find. Everywhere you look, there's 2,000-3,000 year old pottery, just sort of broken up shards of it that they've used to kind of line the paths that you're walking over. It's just it's pretty surreal. But I want to read a little section of scripture because it actually does talk about Cyprus, and we'll come on to that later because I've got a video to come up. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through a little bit of scripture, show you some photos, show you some of the stuff that we've been doing and where we've been visiting, and then basically we have a video to show you that I filmed yesterday at Paphos, which is to do with the section of scripture that we're just going to read here in just a moment. And basically, we're putting out on Creation Conversations the slightly lower quality version, but the full quality 4K version will go up on YouTube at the time that Creation Conversation finishes. So that'll be available for you to go and see there. And we'll try and do one or two other little bits in the time that we've got. But the reading, it comes from Acts chapter 13. Basically, verse 4, it says that Paul, Barnabas, and Mark had been sent by the Holy Spirit to sail to Cyprus. And it says in verse 5, when they arrived in Salamis, which is over on the east side of Cyprus, in the area which is currently occupied by Turkey, which is a whole political thing that's going on at the moment. When they arrived at Salamis, they preached the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews, and they had John as their assistant. Now, when they had gone through the whole island to Paphos, they found a certain sorcerer, a false prophet, a Jew, whose name was Bar Jesus, or Bar Yeshua, who was with the proconsul Sergius Paulus, an intelligent man. This man called for Barnabas and Saul and sought to hear the word of God. But Elymas, the sorcerer, for so his name is translated, withstood them, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. And then Saul, who was also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at him and said, O full of all deceit and all fraud, you son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, will you not cease perverting the straight ways of the Lord? And now indeed the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you shall be blind, not seeing the sun for a time. And immediately a dark mist fell on him, and he went about seeking someone to lead him by the hand. And then the proconsul believed when he saw what had been done, and was astonished at the teaching of the Lord. And then it goes on to say how Paul and his party went round converting people, and then set sail from Paphos and headed back towards Jerusalem. Now, one thing that's become abundantly clear as we've been traveling around Cyprus is at the time that Paul was here, and before Paul was here, leading up to the time that Paul was here in Cyprus, Cyprus is supposedly the birthplace of Aphrodite, right? Or Venus is her Roman equivalent, the Greek goddess of love, specifically the Greek goddess of basically erotica, right? And so it's an island where you have the cult of Aphrodite. It's the island where you have a religious space that is seeped in idolatry and also seeped in the worship of sexual immorality, which is really quite interesting to think that this is the response that Paul got when he came here. And even you have people like this Jew, Bar Jesus, who was here at the time, working with the proconsul, seemingly involved with all of this dodgy stuff and the perversion of the ways of the Lord. So it's been really interesting to travel around and actually see some of the evidence of what people were believing at the time and compare the response that Paul got here to the kind of response that Paul got elsewhere on his travels. I'm just going to pull up some PowerPoints now and run you through some of the places that we've been and some of the places that we've seen, and then finally show you that video. So here we are. We're actually, this is me and there's Sarah and my wife. We're at a place on the south coast of Cyprus, not quite as far along as Paphos, but it's actually a temple area which had a palace as well, linked to the harbour, which was the main base for the cult of Aphrodite. So spectacular ruins, really beautiful places, and like I say, you're encouraged to look around and climb over them. You can see all the rubble. There's bits of pottery just lying around everywhere, and here we are. Here we are at Paphos, in the Tomb of the Kings, which is technically, that's the name, but it's technically not for kings. It's technically sort of the elite, the noblemen of Paphos. This was used from the Hellenistic period to the sort of Ptolemaic period, so sort of early Roman, for about 200 to 300 years. So this is the place where Paphos would have been when Paul arrived, as opposed to where the modern city is, which is set a little bit further back. So fantastic archaeology. You can go down, get into all the tombs, have a look around. Spectacular archaeology and building carved right out into the side of the cliff that you can kind of go and crawl around and have a look in. Incredible pottery and archaeology. I mean, we spent a whole day just wandering around the Cyprus Museum, and there was pottery after artifact. Many of the things that I recognise, some of the things like this particular pot, we actually have an almost exact identical, copy of this, a genuine piece, in our Creation Research Centre. So you can come and see these kind of artifacts even in the UK in our Creation Research Centre. So really quite exciting. This is also at Paphos up on the top of the hill. This is at the Cult of Aphrodite place up in the palace. This is part of the Acropolis, so the fortification near the temple. And you can see this huge, I mean, it's just absolutely, you couldn't get up close to it, unfortunately. It's one of the only things that actually had a barrier around it, but it's just absolutely enormous. I mean, that is probably about 8 foot tall, that sort of altar incense offering burner thing, right? It reminded me of when the scripture talks about the big bowl that was built outside of the temple, outside of Solomon's temple. But you can also see the sort of pagan elements of it. You've got the cow, and of course, this is the kind of thing that plagued the children of Israel. They worshipped calves and baby cows, famously, of course, with Moses, but also when they're fallen to Baal and stuff like that, there's the depictions of the cow as well. Great big pillars everywhere you go, absolutely beautiful, stunning archaeology that you can just go and explore. I mean, it really is like, archaeologist's paradise. If you're interested in this stuff, I highly recommend it. The weather, by the way, is absolutely beautiful as well. We've only had a couple of bits of rain, and it's mostly been in the evening. For the most part, the weather has been, I mean, we are middle of November, right? It's cold and wet and miserable back at home. And here it's sort of 25 degrees Celsius and just absolutely gorgeous, even able to go swimming and stuff. But this is another interesting element. If you head over towards the capital is actually split in two. So there's a long political history, which is slightly complicated, but basically a small number of Cypriots, when they basically gained independence from Britain, they established, Britain helped them establish their own government. A small number of Cypriots had allegiance to Turkey, and as a result, Turkey invaded and basically claimed part of Cyprus for their own, and Turkey now claims that North Cyprus is an independent state. Nobody else, no other country on the planet recognizes it as an independent state. It's all recognized as Cyprus under Turkish, or North Cyprus under Turkish occupation. But what's interesting is that they've actually developed their own flag, which is essentially a reverse, it's identical but a flipped color scheme of the Turkish flag. So the Turkish flag was obviously red with the white stripes and the white crescent moon and star. So this is basically a flip of that. And as you're driving along towards the city, which you can see beneath there, up in the mountains, there's no mistaking which part of the country you're sort of heading towards, because you have this enormous Turkish flag essentially etched into the side of the mountains. I mean, it is just phenomenally huge. It's actually seen from space. There's sort of a no man's land in between. The city is kind of split in two. All the touristy stuff, of course, is in the Cypriot part. That's what it looks like from the satellite image. So you can see you've got the sickle moon, or the crescent moon, and you've got the star. Now, what's interesting is if you go onto the North Cyprus website, the official North Cyprus website, where of course they talk about their history and being heroically liberated by the Turkish government, they talk about why they use this flag, which of course has connections with the Turkey, but they actually say that even though these symbols are now associated with Islam, their symbols and their meanings go back a lot further than that. And that's basically all they say. And it really is true. And you don't have to go very far to find evidence of that, because just in the Cyprus Museum, which is in the Cypriot part of the capital city, you see figurines like this. You see him with a funny pointed hat on. These are actually depictions of Baal, the god Baal. So Baal had a few different representations. This is him in his human form. He also came in a cow form with horns, and you can see influence of that in the Hindus and their cows being sacred because it was influenced there. But also he had his symbol, the thing which represented him, and it was the crescent moon, right? It was the sickle moon. So you see this, he stole that or the spirit of it, if you like, stole that from the old Mesopotamian god Sin, whose representation was also that of the crescent moon. So you've got this pagan influence all the way through. And you don't have to go very far to find the pagan influence for the star either. Here we are just yesterday up high in the coast there, and you can see behind us Aphrodite's rock. So this is the place where Aphrodite supposedly was born. The idea is that if you swim around the rock all the way once, you'll become more beautiful or something like that. But I won't show you a picture of Aphrodite because she's usually depicted obviously naked or semi-naked. But the whole basis of it is that she was actually taken as an influence from the old Babylonian god Ishtar or Asharte. And you'll find that they have this epicenter of paganism, which started with the Babylonians. It's spread out, obviously that can be traced back to the Tower of Babel. It's spread out to the Greeks with Aphrodite. It spread out into the Anglo-Saxons through the Etruscans, and it ended up becoming the Anglo-Saxon goddess, which is where the inspiration for the name Easter came from. So you find there's connections not just in the names and also the linguistics, but also the images, the idea of being for love or fertility or for sexual immorality, but also the symbol of the star is associated all the way through. So you've got some interesting sort of pagan connections that you can kind of start to trace through and think about a little bit deeper. And there it is there, as they said, associated with Islam, but it's not just the sickle moon and the star that's associated with Islam. If you look at the pronunciation of Baal, we of course B-A-A-L, right? That's the English, we call them Baal. But if you look up the original pronunciation, it's pronounced Bala, which sounds a lot like Allah. So again, interesting connections there as well. What I'm going to do now, finish the PowerPoint there. We've had a great time here so far. I've got a few more films that I'd like to bring and a few more clips and stuff. We'll see what we can do with them. But what I'll do now is I'll just see if I can play a little video. It's about 7 minutes long, but it talks about Paphos, a bit about what we've been talking about, and an interesting thought that we had when comparing the response that Paul got here in Cyprus to what he got in Greece on Mars Hill. So I'll play that now, and then I think we'll have a bit of a break and ask some questions. But let's put this up and see if it works. G'day folks, Indiana Joe here on location in Cyprus. We're here in Cyprus, courtesy of British Airways, who way back in, do you remember all the COVID 2020 stuff, right? There was a bit of confusion over reimbursements and stuff like that, and we ended up with free flights, so we took them. We had Cyprus having a bit of a break, but also looking at some of the absolutely fantastic archaeological sites. And there are biblical references as well. Yes, right now, where we currently are is Paphos, mentioned in scripture. The Apostle Paul went there, right? Specifically, we're in an archaeological park in Paphos, and the modern day city is actually about 2 miles in that direction. We're in the old part, which would have been the part that what it looked like when the Apostle Paul came here. So it's amazing to get, up close and see what it actually looked like and felt like. Now, specifically, we're in the Tomb of the Kings. More accurately, it's a tomb area for the noblemen of Cyprus and the rich people. It was used predominantly during the end of the Hellenistic period and into the Ptolemaic period, so sort of beginning of the Roman Empire. So it would have certainly been in use and been looking pretty good at the time that Paul came here. He didn't sail here, however. You see, the Apostle Paul landed in Salamis, which is over on the east side of the island, currently, which is the area occupied by Turkey. He then walked about 90 miles with Barnabas and with Mark, and ended up here in Paphos and sought out the consul, the guy in charge, right? Because this was the capital at the time. And of course, you can read about it in Acts chapter 13. It's a pretty cool read. He had a run-in with a guy called Bar Jesus or Bar Yeshua, who was some kind of demon worshipper, witchcraft side of stuff, ended up performing a miracle, blinding the guy permanently, and off he went. And it has a rather interesting little connection because it says that the consul then believed. When he saw the evidence, he believed, and many people accepted with him.
Now, a little bit of historical context can be very, very useful when understanding what was going on here. Because, well, Cyprus was the birthplace of Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, and she was worshipped here. In fact, just around the corner we visited earlier, you had Aphrodite's rock, where she supposedly came naked out of the sea, riding on a shell. And you had a cult. The cult of Aphrodite was based here. It was a deeply religious place, and she was worshipped as the goddess of love. Now, this is Greek love, right? So there's four kinds. You've got unconditional love, you've got motherly love, brotherly love, and then erotica, right? Sexual love. And it was the sexual love that Aphrodite was famous for. You see, she was not only worshipped, and not only was she worshipped, it was also the whole concept of sexual immorality that was worshipped. So we have an area here, a island, a place which is steeped not only in religion but also in sexual immorality and the worship of sexual immorality and this goddess Aphrodite. And a whole cult was based around here. So what you have is you have Paul coming here with Barnabas and with Mark, and they are presenting the truth. They're going from synagogue to synagogue, and they're presenting the truth. And people accept it, even to the point of the highest guy in charge, who believed and accepted it when he heard the truth, when he saw the evidence. That was it, acception. Now, compare that with what happened when Paul went to Mars Hill, right? He went there. Now, this is the height of Greek philosophical thinking, right? The height of Greek philosophical culture. And he went there, and there was the tomb of the altar of the unknown God. He stood up, he started with Genesis, and he went from Genesis to Jesus. A very good way of doing it, by the way. And he took them through the reason why they needed a saviour. And what was the response? Many mocked, we're told. Some said, hey, we'll hear you out on this again, and a few believed. A rather different reaction to what was happening when Paul came here to Cyprus. So why would a pagan, extremely pagan, sexually immoral, idol-worshipping culture like they had here in Cyprus accept better than they did in Mars Hill? Well, I suspect it has something to do with what was going on with the Greek world at the time, particularly in the centre of Greek philosophical culture. They were actually moving away from paganism in the truest sense of paganism, but retaining key pagan ideas and moving towards naturalism. Even though they were contextually pagan, right, they were still a polytheistic people by nature, they had started to move away from the idea of many gods and into the idea of naturalism, into the idea that we are gods, into the idea that given enough time, life can arise from non-life. Given enough time, there really isn't any need for a god, because you replace that god with time. In other words, the Greeks believed in evolution, and it was a very racist version of evolution, because they believed that they'd evolved from the slime, and they believed that they'd evolved out of better quality slime than the Jews had. Nothing new under the sun, right? But here you have a predominantly pagan but naturalistically pagan culture at Mars Hill, and most mocked. Few said, oh, well, interesting, we'll hear you again, and even fewer actually believed. But yet in a world which is full of religion here in Cyprus, in a world that was so vastly removed from the idea of godliness, that was so seeped in idol worship and sexual immorality, when they heard the truth and when they saw evidence of it, right? Paul snapping his fingers and the guy going blind, right? The one who was trying to get them shut down. People believed. Interesting historical context. Now, I wonder which culture we're most like today. Oh yeah, it's the naturalistic pagan thinking of the Greeks of Mars Hill. Not necessarily the same as what you had here in Cyprus. That's why we need to take Paul's tactic of starting from Genesis and going outwards. You've got to start with that good foundation, and it's been really, really spectacular to be able to come here to Cyprus and actually get a bit of that context, actually be where Paul came, be where Paul visited. And I mean, it's middle of November, the sun is starting to set, it's only about 3:30, and it's still sort of, mid-20s. It's been really, really warm today, so it's really nice to get out and have a bit of an explore as well. I mean, just have a look at what we've got around us. Absolutely stunning and beautiful. And these are all tombs around here. These are all places. Archaeology is just absolutely abundant. Everywhere you look, there's bits of pottery and stuff kind of strewn around. So thanks for watching, and we'll probably try and do one or two other little things, but this is really a holiday for me and Sarah Ann, so don't expect too much. But we've got some big plans coming up later, which I'm sure we'll discuss on Creation Conversations at some point, so check us out there. Until next time, we'll catch you later.
So there you go. A little bit of an update and some food for thought there as well. And like I say, that was the low quality, because basically when we when I put it together and edited it together earlier today, the export in the high quality 4K was many gigabytes, which our poor Restream, well, our current subscription to Restream doesn't handle particularly well. So that will go up once Creation Conversations is finished. I'll set it up loading before I go to bed, and that will hopefully be up and ready to go by the time Creation Conversations is finished. So the full 4K production will be up there. On that note, actually, we were discussing just before the show a little bit about the future of Creation Conversations and what we're planning to do, and so a few bits like that. And we could do with upgrading a few things, we could do with tweaking a few things. So continue to support us, continue to pray for us, and your support really does help. It'd be wonderful if we could make all of the stuff that we do with Creation Conversations self-sustaining, but there's a lot of things that we would like to be able to do to make it better and to make it more accessible, especially with some of the new documentaries and apps and websites and stuff like that. So continue to support us. But how about we have a quick break and answer a couple of questions before I disappear for the evening?
Joe,
Yeah,
just a thought. It might be good to get some viewer input on what they'd like to hear. Right? So
yes, I agree.
who would they send that to?
You can email us at info@creationresearchuk.com. That's the easiest way. If Sam can put something up, that'd be grand. info@creationresearchuk.com. Alternatively, you can comment on the videos. We do monitor the videos that have gone up. If you comment on the most recent one, that's a great idea, because it means that we're more likely to pick it up than one that's sort of 2 years old. Excuse me. But yeah, if you can, we'd love some feedback. And what would you like us to deal with? What's a topic that you would like us to sort of do? Because we've been doing this for we get a year and a half, nearly 2 years. So we'd love to be able to deal with the stuff that you are interested in. So keep it coming, keep ideas coming, keep topics coming, and that would be wonderful. All right, Sam, how about a question or two? Let's do 2 questions if we have them before.
All right, then that's absolutely fine. We've got some thanks to give out first. So first up, out of the blue, Doki has not appeared today. So the crown for first donation comes in from Stacey H. Thank you so much, Stacey. $9.99 US buckaroos. God bless everyone. Hope everyone is well. I'm well. I can't speak for the rest of the team, but thank you so much. And George, bless him, 20 Aussie buckaroos. Hi, John. Diane, some flowers, thoughts and prayers. There you go. Oh, that's sweet. Right, so we've got 2 questions ready to go. First one comes in from Shogiwa. Shogi says, a while ago you showed a picture of a giant tree branch. I was wondering how you know it's a branch and not the trunk.
Okay, that's a question for yours truly, John Mackay. And when I was investigating fossil trees and fossil soil to establish whether trees had grown there or not, I came across 2 interesting things. Number one, when I checked with university soil scientists and asked them how they'd recognize a fossil soil, they said, well, that's the job of the geologist. And then when I checked with the leading geologists and said, how would they recognize a fossil soil? They said that that's not our job, that's the job of the soil scientists. So I came across a vacuum in knowledge. And then when I began investigating fossil trees, I began saying, how would I recognize if this vertical tree is actually upside down? And many shrugs and many scratched heads later, it became very evident that most people never ask these questions. So how would you recognize a branch as distinct from a tree? It turns out after much inquiry and much checking of cellular photographs of fossil trees, it's fairly easy, even though almost unknown. If you think of a tree that's been standing upright all its life, then all the gravitational forces are fairly uniform down the tree, right? So if you then take the branches coming off the side, what you find is as the branch branches out, forgive the pun there, as it branches out from the tree, the gravitational forces are tending to push the branch down the further out it gets. So here's what happens. On the top part of a branch, the cells stretch. On the bottom part of the branch, the cells are compressed. And this is fairly distinguishable when you actually do a section of the tree and then an elongate section of the tree. You can actually measure the difference between the actual size of the cells and see stretched versus compressed. So when you check, that's how you know. There's obviously an easier way, and that is if it's still attached to the branch, still attached to the trunk. And in the case of the big one I showed you, the actual tree trunk that it comes from is still pretty well there. It's just, if that's the branch, this is way big to actually dig out. I showed you another fossil tree, the first giant one I'd ever found, and that was the trunk, and it was 410 feet or 130 meters long. So no, you don't sort of get the tractor out and shift it. These are enormous sort of structures from a world where the climate was way better. But that's the simple rule. If you're looking at a branch, it'll be stretched on one side cellularly, it'll be compressed on the other. Hope that's a blessing.
Great stuff. Thank you for that, John. Do we have another question there, Sam?
We do indeed. Iron Matt has slid into our donation pot here with 4 US buckaroos, a pair character, exaggeratedly stretching his arm forward to offer a cup of coffee. I'm afraid a bottle of water will have to do, but thank you very much. Next one comes in from George. George says, question, some evolutionists are again using E. coli digesting criteria as evidence for evolution. Can you expand, please? I'm sure this was debunked by evolutionary biologists themselves.
Diane, you're the expert in this area.
Yes, this refers to an experiment that's been going on for years and years and years, where a group of microbiologists have been breeding E. coli, which is a type of very common bacteria, in the lab, and just basically reculturing them and hoping that mutations are somehow going to change them and they will be able to see the bacteria evolve after so many generations. Now, the reason they're doing this in bacteria is that the generation time for bacteria is pretty short compared to if you want to study evolution in people or animals or plants. You've often got to wait for years, but in bacteria, you get a few generations within a day. So it's a good way to see if there are any changes occurring from one generation to the other. As someone has just put up on the chat, this was led by someone named Lenski. So it is referred to as the Lenski experiment, but it's been going on for years and years and years with a whole team of microbiologists. But anyway, what they did is they found that they did get a subculture of bacteria that were able to digest citrate, which is an organic molecule, in different conditions, in anoxic conditions. And they considered that to be a good mutation in that the bacteria could now digest a substance that it normally only digests in anoxic conditions, meaning without oxygen, whereas they were just subculturing them in normal air, so that's full of oxygen. So the bacteria now has more things to eat, so that's a good mutation. But in fact, all that's happened is that the channel that enables the in the cell wall and the cell membrane that enables the citrate to get into the bacteria has just changed its shape so that it can the citrate can get in. So it's a bit like having a door that's shut in some circumstances and opened in another, that somehow gets jammed open so that it's open all the time. So it's not really an evolutionary change. The bacteria are actually still the same bacteria. They're still E. coli, so nothing's changed. They've just multiplied after their kind, but some of them just have this sort of slightly changed channel for transporting citrate across their membrane. We have written about this in our fact file and on our Ask site. Actually, there's a specific question about it. If Sam can put up the Ask site, yes, you'll find more details about it there, and also in our fact file. So do have a look at that. It's called the Lenski experiment or the E. coli experiment, and you should be able to find it just with the normal keyword search. Yes.
Just a confession, in my summary of the cholera outbreak, I really oversimplified. So if you want to know the additional role of bacteria in that disease and the floods and all of that, we've written on that too, haven't we, Diane?
Yes, we have. The cholera is actually caused by a bacteria, but it's very interesting. This bacteria was always assumed for many years that it could only live in human digestive systems, and that's what caused the problem until someone actually did some research and discovered, well, this is actually a bacteria that really belongs out in the environment. It's just bad luck or bad management that it gets into human digestive systems. So it must have a function out in the normal environment, and in fact it does. These copepods are actually little shelled animals. They have a sort of hard outer casing, and the cholera bacteria help to break that down. So it's part of the natural cycle of recycling nutrients that's built into the natural environment. And what's happened is that gets out of control when there are algal blooms and other things like that, which can be caused by poor water management from human activity or from just natural cycles. So it's a mixture of these little shelled animals, the bacteria, and damage to the water management or natural disasters. It's all of those things put together that you get cholera outbreaks.
And none of the copepods were as big as my fossil one there, right? And
no, they're not. They're really tiny. They're
really
sort of
tiny. And I'd encourage you.
The millimeter size. Yes.
Yeah, we also put it on our video. Did a good God make bad bugs? And we also put it on the real history of worms and germs. So they're available as streaming. So Sam, if you'll put up our streaming address, they can get those from. The first one, Did a Good God Make Bad Bugs, was specifically made and handed to David Attenborough, right? So you want to make sure you get a copy of that. And our second one was done at a conference, a health conference in London. And Diane provided the brains for the medical background and me for the fossil experiments and things like that. You will find those are both very helpful. So that's Did a Good God Make Bad Bugs and the real history of worms and germs. And go to our website, look at the videos, look at the streaming. They will be very helpful, as well as looking at Facebook and not Facebook, our fact file and our Q&A. Okay, anybody else got any other questions?
Well, I think
that's it for questions so far.
Now.
So it's a good chance for Joe to make his swift exit.
I think so.
Thank you very much, guys. Enjoy. And like I said, the full, I nearly said full K, the full quality 4K, whatever. The proper video will be up of the Paphos video will be up hopefully by the end of this broadcast, but it depends on how long it takes to to render and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I will see you next week. And remember, get in your topics that you would like to hear us discuss and talk about. So we'll see you next time.
Sunrise is in 4 hours.
Don't hit the end stream button, please.
I'm not.
I know you're tired, but please don't.
I know. See you, everyone.
Enjoy your holiday. All the
Leave
best.
site. Yes, I do want to leave, but I don't want to end the stream. Bye-bye, all.
Okay.
Bye.
Diane, perhaps if you take over with your slides first from London, and then I'll give a review of mine for our next big open question time.
Yes, just before you do, Diane, can I just say, if you have a question, please stick it in the chat. Make sure you put Q before it so I can see it. It can be on anything we've discussed or anything else, really. We prefer if you could try and stick to topics, but we understand sometimes questions are limited. So please get your questions in nonetheless. And if we don't get to your question, we do save them. We will come to them in a dedicated Q&A session. Breathe. Okay, on to you, Diane.
Yes, well, I must apologise for the croaky voice. It's a combination of jet lag and dehydration and all those fun things that happen when you fly for 30 hours halfway around the world. But I did have a good time for my last week in the UK in London. And whenever I go to London, I like to go to the Natural History Museum. As those of you who live in the UK, of course, are very familiar with. If you don't know this building, you might think, well, isn't that one of those wonderful old European churches? Well, in fact, it was originally meant to be, quote unquote, a cathedral to nature. The founder of the Natural History Museum was curator of the natural history type specimens that were part of the wider British Museum, which has all sorts of historical and archaeological specimens and other things of interest. And Richard Owen wanted to have a specific museum set aside for all of the natural history specimens, fossils, and various plants and animals, for people to come and see the amazing variety of natural things out in the natural world, plants and animals and fossils out in the natural world. So he wanted to build a spectacular building that would be a cathedral to nature. And the museum are promoting this concept of a cathedral to nature, because they seem to have a problem with some of Owen's other ideas. Now, as you go into this cathedral to nature, and I didn't take this photo, but I found it on a public domain website, but I thought it shows the, because of the lighting, it does have this sort of cathedral-like quality. But look in the center of the photo, down in the bottom third, and see what is the center point of the cathedral. Who or what is the focus of worship? Now, if you've been there, of course, you will know that this is the view you get as you come in the main central hall. You look through the hall and up a flight of stairs, and on the landing there is that white statue, and it's not Richard Owen, the founder of the museum. It used to be, but now it's someone who's far more well known. If I can get the PowerPoint to, yes, there we are. That's a better view as you look through the central hall, up the stairs. And yes, it's Charles Darwin. In 2009, the Darwin anniversary, they actually shifted. They had a statue of Richard Owen in that place. They shifted him out and put Charles Darwin there. And even though that was 2009, so that's 13 years ago now, he's still there, and he's still the central character. And each time you go to the museum, there are lots and lots of people there, of course, and there are people who are just determined to have their photo taken with Charles Darwin, seem to consider that to be a privilege. And when I was there last time, which was only last week, actually it wasn't too long ago, there are a group of American tourists there who read the little plaque that's there identifying him as Charles Darwin, and one of them was saying, "Oh yes, he was the greatest natural scientist there was in the 19th century." Well, I think there are some of us who might dispute that. What have they done with Richard Owen? Well, they have shifted him to a rather dark place, and this photo is not deliberately underexposed. It is a dark place, and it's actually quite a hard place to get a good photo of him. Now, part of the problem there is that the statue is black. It's Richard Owen in his academic robes, but they have shifted him up to the mezzanine floor, right down the end, and you have to go looking for him to know that he's there. Most of the tourists would never know that he was there. In fact, a few years ago, when I was at the museum, after they had shifted him away and I couldn't find him, I asked one of the young volunteer guides where had they put the statue of Richard Owen, and I received a blank look. And I was pointed to the statue of Charles Darwin, and I had to explain, "No, I'm sorry, that is Charles Darwin. What have you done with Richard Owen?" And one of the other volunteer guides knew and pointed me in the right direction, and I was eventually able to find him. Now, they do admit that Richard Owen was a brilliant scientist, and this is in that corner where they have his statue. There is a little display about the history of the museum, and it is worth going and looking at. It has fascinating in terms of just its architecture and the way it is decorated with all sorts of brilliant illustrations of various plants and animals, and the actual structure of it and the history. And there were other people involved, of course. But they do admit that Richard Owen was what they call a masterful anatomist. In other words, he was the leading expert in both living creatures and fossil creatures at his time, and people from all over the world would send him things for him to identify. And as it says there, the most respected and influential scientist of his generation. He pioneered the science of comparative anatomy. In other words, looking at the anatomy of different animals, studying the physical similarities and differences between species. And you would think, well, if they have such a founder as this, surely they would have him in the center of the museum. Surely he's someone to be proud of. But also, as part of this display about the history of the museum, there is another photo of him there. He does look like a rather dour sort of character, but you have to remember, in those days, to have your photo portrait taken, you had to sit still for quite a while because of the technology of taking a photo of someone inside using a film camera. So most people whose photos are taken in the late 19th century do look rather grim, because it's very, very hard to hold your face in exactly the same pose for a sufficient time. However, this description here that's of part of his work is rather interesting. Now, it is behind glass, so I do apologize for the reflections. As I say, it's in a very awkward part of the museum. It's a dark corner, but there is a bright light window next to it, and I couldn't get away from the reflections. But it's about Sir Richard Owen's Index Museum. In other words, he wanted to organize and classify all of the different sorts of plants and animals and fossils that were in the museum. And that is part of what science is, that the classification system was actually invented before Owen's time by Linnaeus, who got his inspiration from the Bible. So the classification system, which has been taken over by the evolutionists, really belongs to the Christians. It belongs to the Bible believers because that's where the original inspiration for it came from, rather. Now, it's a bit hard to read that, so I've actually taken a close-up of part of the that description there, where it says Owen held strong ideas about how public displays should be arranged in the new museum. His concept for what he called an index museum involved using the bays surrounding the cathedral-like central hall. So that's that big central hall with those bays on either side, to display representative species of several taxonomic groups. Now look at this, that Owen believed had been shaped by an evolution dictated by God. Now we know from history the one thing that Richard Owen did not believe in was evolution. He was actually a fierce opponent of Darwin. He did believe in God. So his cathedral to nature was actually a cathedral of God's creation. It was not a cathedral to evolution, which it has become now. So they really are not telling you the right history of the museum or about Richard Owen. And I think there needs to be a campaign to put Richard Owen back in his proper place in terms of this museum, because the only reason that we have this museum with its wonderful collection, and it is truly staggering, amazing collection, of plants, animals, artifacts, and minerals and fossils, is mostly due to this man. So he really deserves the praise that he's not getting now and that has been handed over to Charles Darwin. Now, if we can just have a bit of a break there, because John, you visited the museum many times, and I'm sure you might like to make some comments, and you've also studied the history of Richard Owen. If we can just come back to us for the moment.
Well, I certainly have. We've even filmed in the museum, and any of you
Yes.
who've seen our dinosaur DVDs, go and have a look. We paid the British Museum £1,000 an hour to actually get the rights to film in there, and it was an expensive documentary, but still really wonderful stuff, because they have the first dinosaur in which you can actually see the whole skeleton there, with the tail bent over, the head bent back, provably drowned. Now, there's no denying that was a drowned dinosaur, and every time scientists have dug up whole dinosaurs, the majority of them you will find had that tail over and bent back, something that was only conceded a few years ago when they did experiments with, surprise, surprise, chickens, right, to see why they ended up with their neck bent over and their tail bent backwards. And the answer is submersion in water, otherwise called drowning, right? But what they don't tell you is that you had to not only drown it, that gave it sort of fixed position as it gasped for its last breath, and the back sort of tensed and brought the tail back up, but you had to bury it in that position before rigor mortis sort of stopped. So you had to bury it frozen in time. So it was not only drowning, it was very rapid burial. So yes, we filmed that, and we filmed Richard Owen, and we filmed a lot of these guys, and there's no doubt about it, the whole museum was set up as a praise to the glory of God as creator. That's what it was. And Richard Owen fought tooth and nail against Charles Darwin. He regarded Mr. Darwin as almost an abomination upon the whole British landscape. And so he was Charles Darwin's bitterest opponent. And he said, basically, Mr. Darwin, the fossils don't show anything you're talking about. And that's why you read in Darwin's book, in the geology chapter, the fossils are the worst part of his theory. Because if he'd written anything else, the world's leading fossil expert would have said, Darwin, you are a liar. You have not told the truth. And I told you that was the case. So Richard Owen set up that museum to the glory of God as creator, certainly a cathedral of nature, but a place where, in fact, it's disgusting that they have actually lied about Darwin believing in evolution by God. That's the last thing Owen would have believed at all. So, surprise, surprise, experts, authorities do lie. That's what's happened in that museum. So you're quite right, Diane. It'd be nice if some well-funded people would actually intervene in that museum and put it back to what it should be. Sadly, the Queen's gone now. She was the last sort of link to that, because her funding keeps that a public museum. I don't know what will happen now, but I can't see any of the royals currently taking a stand on Richard Owen, telling the truth about the fossils.
Yes, yes. And also the way that the museum has worded that paragraph is part of a trend that's happening now, where every biological process these days is described as an evolutionary process, which is another piece of just brainwashing and propaganda.
Okay, Diane, anything else you want to comment on, or we'll move on to the next one?
Well, I do have another section. The other place that I go to regularly, of course, is Kew Gardens, and so I have a little bit about that. If we can go to the, if we can go back to the PowerPoint now. Thank you. Let's just see if we can get this to move ahead. Right. Yes. At Kew Gardens, they're very proud of having found a new species of giant Amazon water lily. And they have this in their tropical greenhouse. So even though it was November and it was rather wet and chilly outside, the tropical greenhouse was just full of the most beautiful tropical flowers, including orchids. Some of them were almost as good as the orchids we have at Jurassic Ark. But the thing they were particularly proud of this time was this giant Amazon water lily. And you may have heard of this. It's rather an iconic sort of plant because it has these enormous leaves. They're the biggest leaves in the world. They are really huge. And you can see here how they compare to the size of the ordinary water lilies or the other water lilies. These large leaves are an interesting study for scientists, because they have looked at these things and say, well, why did this plant grow such large leaves? Well, there are advantages in that having large leaves is a large surface area for photosynthesis. In other words, that's how the plant gets its first basic nutrients from the sun. So leaves are basically just giant solar panels, far more complicated than any solar panels that we've ever designed. So the bigger the leaf area in a plant, the bigger the surface area for photosynthesis. So the individual water lily leaves really are very good for feeding this plant. However, you have to there is a disadvantage, of course, in that the bigger the leaves, well, you do have a larger leaf mass and it's quite heavy and it uses more of the plant's resources to maintain. So if, a couple of years ago, scientists based at Oxford University decided that they would actually study this, and they looked at these leaves in a lot more detail. Now, you can see here, this is another plant. This isn't actually at Kew Gardens, but this photo does show you the sort of trellis work that lies underneath these leaves that literally holds them up. And this is the pattern of veins. Now, all leaves have veins. Sometimes they're more obvious than others, which is the internal plumbing for the leaves. But it's also the structural support of the leaves, because the walls of the internal plumbing, of the pipes, as it were, are stiff, and that is what holds the leaf up and what gives it its structure and its shape. And that applies to all plants. So it's the same with these giant leaves, but they need a particularly strong set of plumbing, as it were, or structural framework in order to hold these leaves up. And as we know from architecture and engineering, it's not just the amount of mass that you have in a structure that makes it strong, it's also the architecture and the geometry. So scientists have studied the geometry of these things, and if you look on the back, you can see there's this particular trellis-like pattern. And they looked at this pattern and measured the strength of the the substances that make up this and put that all into a computer model and worked out that this really is a piece of brilliant architecture in terms of getting the right combination of something that is extremely strong but also lightweight. And to get something that is very strong but also lightweight takes quite clever engineering design. And so they found that these large leaves had this amazing network of veins, which was very strong but very light. Now, there is also a problem with leaves growing on in riverbeds or rivers where they grow in the wild, in the Amazon, in that in these rivers you have wading birds and water creatures. Now, with small water lily leaves, that's not a problem. They just sort of push them aside. But these big ones, they do tend to be damaged if wading birds and other creatures come into them. But you can see how the edges of them are actually standing up. And in fact, they you can see the pattern of the veins there, but there is a distinct folded edge so that they don't completely become flat. Now, they do start out sort of partly rolled up, and here we are back in Kew Gardens now, and you can see there's a new one that's just emerging from the stem there, and it's starting to unroll, and they don't completely unroll. They have this standing up edge there so that they are not damaged by water birds and by other creatures, and you can see there's a distinct fold there in the structure. And that has to be programmed into the leaf, so as part of the control of its growth. So they are flexible, so that avoids being damaged by birds and by other things that live in the river. Now, because they have that that rim there, there is a bit of a problem. The Amazon is a place where there is a lot of rain. And these things grow in a rainforest, and so water will just run off small leaves, but it will be trapped by the folded edge of large leaves. So you can see there's a normal water lily leaf there, which is just completely flat. Rain will run off that. However, that has also been taken care of in the giant water lily leaves. The large leaves actually have holes in them for rain drainage, so that they don't fill up with rain and then sink. So it's often in these very, very little things that you see the sort of foreknowledge that's needed for clever design. So the large leaf design involves the network of veins that's very strong and very light. It's very flexible, and it has holes for the rainwater to flow through. And the scientists who looked at the structure of these things published their study earlier this year, and they said, we show that the geometric form of the leaf is structurally more efficient than other smaller species of water lilies. In other words, it has all of these extra features. So you then have to ask, well, where did it get those extra features for? Well, it had to be in their DNA and in the growth control genes that not only make the leaves grow bigger, but also have those extra features to make them more efficient. And as we know, merely just knocking the chemicals around in your genome does not actually produce anything new or better. It actually causes information to be lost. So new genetic information is needed if you're going to make these water lilies in your evolutionary idea that these evolved from another type of water lily, whereas in fact these have always been the same kind as far as we know. And one of the Oxford scientists made this comment: remarkable structures in nature can help us unlock design challenges in engineering. And the form of these water lilies could inspire giant floating platforms such as solar panels in the ocean. There's a lot we can learn from leaves. Now, just a moment, who are we learning from? yes, we can learn a lot when we study leaves, but what we see is really clever design engineering and clever genetic information that has been inserted into these water lily leaves. So we're not learning from the leaves, we're learning as we look at the leaves, but ultimately we should be giving the honour to the Creator who made heaven and earth and all that is in them, including the holes in water lily leaves and all of those little things that show you the brilliant forethought that's gone into these. So even though Kew Gardens might be claiming, oh yes, we found a new species of giant Amazon water lily, they are all still giant Amazon water lilies. What they found was a bit of variation in the structure of the flowers. The leaves are all the same. So these are still the same kind. So these water lilies are their own kind. They have multiplied after their kind. There is a bit of variation, but as we show in our Jurassic Ark site, you can get tremendous variation within the same kind. And as you look at these, we see brilliant design and we see after their kind. In other words, we see what the Creator has told us in Genesis, who created all things according to their kinds. And if we can just go back to us now and finish there.
Diane, I think probably before
Yes.
we move on to me and Sam, it's probably a good time to check for donations or for new questions, mate.
Yes, yes, of course.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we haven't had any other donations come through, but we have had a question come in from Christina Eastwood. Now, this is a two-part question because the character limit on YouTube. So I will put up the first part, then the second part. And they say, precisely who and when decided that fossil means over 10,000 years old? I asked a science forum, but no one answered. The word seems to have been an adjective first, Johnson's dictionary, online. Sources say used as a noun circa 1736, but can't find out who first came up with that silly number. We all know why. OED probably has the info, but I can't access it.
As far as we know, that's a fairly accurate statement that is made. The figure just sort of slowly begins to appear, and it then becomes accepted without anybody bothering to test it whatsoever. Now, Diane, have you got any specific information on that figure? It just is there, and it's obviously been conspired to promote, and it's definitely promoted. It's definitely in the science textbooks by the 1950s and 60s, but again, without any references at all. Diane, any comment?
Yes, it seems to be a fairly modern thing in terms of a 20th century thing. The original definition of a fossil was simply something that you dug up out of a hole. There was nothing to do with age. So it seems to be part of when the theory of evolution and long ages just became embedded in everyone's mindset. The first thing, if you ever show a photo of a fossil, I find in my presentations, and I'm sure you find this all the time, John, as soon as someone sees a picture of a fossil, how old is that? They assume that it must be millions of years old, or at least many thousands of years old. So that the figure of 10,000 just seems to have been plucked out of the air as a way of embedding this deep time. And of course, it is a significant amount of time, because if you read the Bible in terms of the lengths of time that you can make the creation old, you certainly come up with a figure that's less than 10,000. Once you get over that, you've really got to sort of throw the text out and start making it symbolic or whatever is rather than real history. So I think it's all part of the trend during the 20th century of embedding the whole idea of deep time. And of course, the dictionary people, they just look at how often particular words or particular phrases are used in the literature. So as that figure became more and more quoted, that's how the definition would have been eventually got put into the Oxford English Dictionary and all other dictionaries.
I suspect the real culprit is Charles Lyell,
Yes.
even though he, as a lawyer, knew very well he probably wouldn't want to put his name to it. But since we now have his private correspondence, that we must remove Moses from science, right? You can go to our website, look up Lyell, find all the quotes and sources of that. But to remove Moses from science, he, as a trained lawyer, knew that in his day, the belief that the biblical history was accurate gave you a figure of 6,000 or 7,000 years at the most. So if you want to get rid of Moses out of science, and surprise, surprise, Moses was the inspiration for science. 6 days God created, therefore there'd be intelligent design. Therefore there'd be purpose. Therefore there'd be no flood, no fossils until Noah's flood. Therefore Mosaic geology included strata, etc., starting at the time of Noah. And Noah was only 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. So therefore, what better and simpler way, as I keep telling people, even I've told them at Oxford, the first attack on the biblical view of creation was not on creation. It was on the age of the earth, and before that, it was on the flood, right? The flood was the first thing to come under attack. What simpler way than to make any fossil too old for the literal history of the Bible to be true, right? Sneak it in, get it accepted, and then everybody grows up thinking, but fossils are too old for the Bible to be true. And you've won the battle without fighting a war. And I'm pretty sure you could attribute that to Lyell and Lyell's cohort Darwin and Darwin's son, right? And some of the people who just conspired together. And yes, it was conspired. They had to get rid of biblical creation. And like even here in Australia, our Australian Natural History Museum was essentially creationist. And the ABC published an article just a week or two ago on how they tried to get an evolutionist in, a personal friend of Charles Darwin, and the creationists won the day, right? They had to get rid of that concept. To do that, you had to get rid of the millions of years, get rid of the 6,000, 7,000 years, and substitute, first of all, a more acceptable 10,000 figures. Who's going to quibble over that? Well, the sad thing is the theologians should have quibbled over that, and now it's almost too late for them to fight back. So get behind what we're doing, because we are at the front line firing big bullets that they don't like, called, here's the evidence the fossils form fast. Here's the evidence you don't need millions of years with stalactites. Here's the evidence that you can actually do this without vast amounts of time. Isn't that pretty? But it's not the tens of thousands of years that they like to tell you in the caves. Diane, a question just occurred to me before, as you were doing this giant water lily, because remember we did a documentary with water lilies on and design. We used my big dam down the back, and we actually took a thermometer and measured something interesting. I've never heard of anybody doing that for the giant water lilies, but tell us what we actually found when we took a thermometer to the water lily flowers.
Yes, this was actually the water lily flowers. This is, ironically, this is in our Darwin series. It's the second one, the one called An Unnatural Selection. One of the interesting things about water lilies, for a plant that lives in water, but it is like other plants that live on land, it needs to be pollinated, and it is well designed to be pollinated by insects. But when insects fly over water, they do tend to easily lose heat. But you'll often see, and we did observe this in the pond in John's back garden, the insects will often just fly in and they will just sit there and have a lovely time, particularly the tiny little Australian native bees, which are really, really tiny. It turns out that water lily flowers actually generate heat. They burn starch, and now that costs the flower in terms of nutrients and energy, but there is a good purpose in that, because having warm flowers means that the insects that have flown over water to get to the pollen are kept warm, because they've only done half the job. Once they've collected pollen, they then have to fly to another flower, and they have to fly to another water lily flower, meaning they've got to fly over more water. So water lily flowers actually heat their flowers, And so we measured this, and we measured the temperature in the air, we measured the temperature in the water, and we measured the temperature in the center of the flowers. And the flowers were actually about 10 degrees centigrade warmer than the water. So it's a significant floral furnace. That's not just from being out in the sun and absorbing a bit of solar heat. The flowers are actually generating that heat from within.
So
They're not the only flowers that do that, but they are particularly efficient at doing it because they have a particular need. So it's another lovely example of how nothing in the living world works in isolation. It's well designed to work together with the insects. And that's in our second Darwin video.
It is. So they can stream that to, what's it called? Evolution, a very unnatural selection. And
Darwin's
in reality,
evolution, yes,
Darwin's
a very
evolution.
unnatural selection, yes.
You don't need to be red-blooded to be hot, right? There are many solutions to produce. And in fact, I do remember too us finding one other thing, that in a water lily, the breathing holes are on the top of the leaf, whereas in all the other land plants, they're underneath the leaf. Is that what we found?
Well, yes, because the standard story about the evolution of water lilies is because they are a flowering plant with leaves, like plants that grow on the land, that land plants evolve from, or flowering plants evolve from other plants that eventually left the water and grew on land, but for some reason or other, water lilies decided that they would go back and live in water. But by that time, plants had evolved a system of small gaps, small holes in their leaves, where they absorb carbon dioxide and let out oxygen. Now, in most leaves, those are on the underside of the leaf, which helps control the moisture in the plant as well, because the plants also give out water vapor, which is one of the reasons it's so lovely to sit under the shade of a tree rather than just under a piece of shade cloth, because you're getting oxygen and water vapor as well as shade. Now, if you think about that, a land plant has these stomata, or small breathing holes, on the underside of its leaf. If it then goes and lives in the water where its leaves just float on the surface, the breathing holes are on the bottom, that's not going to work. So the breathing holes have to be on the top in order to be where the air is rather than underwater. So water lilies have them on the top. So again, beautifully well-designed plant for living in water. So they are a separate kind to other kinds of plants that live on the land, even though the evolutionists will tell you that they supposedly evolved from plants that evolved on land.
Okay, so Sam, in the absence of any other questions at the moment?
Well, hang on. We have a super chat to give thanks for.
Right,
this comes in from Neil. Super chat, 5 British buckaroos. God bless you, Neil. Thank you so much. Yahoo, I think is how you pronounce the name. The spikes don't look friendly. I'm assuming that was on the water lilies.
All right.
So
when it was opening up,
is that to stop like insects, like or birds and things like that? It's
ripping apart the leaves. Yes.
Okay.
But they are not that hard, actually. They're not like thorns or anything like that. But they do deter small animals and other creatures from ripping them apart. Yes.
There we go. Right, and that's all the messages that we have so far. Some people may have noticed I have shrunken in size. This is not intentional. My chair is broken. So I've been slowly descending for the past 15 minutes or so, and I've just hit the bottom. So you'll have to bear with me on my stat. Oh, it's going down even more. Oh, no. Okay, so John, do you want to take it away with your presentation?
Okay, yes.
Then?
Now, John Mackay is going to do 2 things. One is with a couple of samples here, which I'm really good at. And then Sam and I have been trying to get this laptop, this is the one we have problems with, to connect up to the PowerPoint. Sam has done a wonderful job in sending me a list of what buttons to press, etc. I don't guarantee to actually make it work, but you can tolerate John Mackay this late in the program. Okay, creation research has an emphasis on creation, creator, Christ, and part of the research we do is to deal with real research, test, try, keep the things that turn out to be good. One of the things that's puzzled us sometimes is when we find fossils, we find that sometimes they're different colors. Now, we've been running some experiments as to taking the same plants, like this one here, if you can sort of see that, that's sort of already brown. This one here is still browny green. And you look at that and say, that's the same plant. It is, and it was actually entombed in our plastic clay bag on exactly the same date. These two are exactly the same. Look at that beautiful. We make fossils, by the way, using clay blocks and evacuated plastic bags. These were entombed on the same day. The date is on the top. It was the 16th of the 9th, 2022. So that's not too long ago, maybe nearly 2 months. Look at the difference. Okay. Now, what have we done? I decided, because when you drill down, particularly I noticed this in Alaska, when you bring up some of the leaves, they're still bright green, maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 meters deep. You dig them up and they're bright green. I've only ever found bright green leaves when I excavated a diatomite deposit, and lo and behold, when I opened the fossils, they were bright green. And yet many of the fossils are not green, that they seem to have been faded. They seem to have turned black. So we've been running experiments on what could actually cause this difference. Sometimes it's extreme. See that one there? You can almost not see any fossils. If I get it close up, you can see the outline still there, and it's beautifully preserved in detail. But when I have it like this, these are entombed on the same day. And it turns out the difference between all of those is the role of ultraviolet light. If they have quite a bit of ultraviolet light, they seem to fade. They still turn to fossils, but some of them, if they have no exposure to ultraviolet light, they actually stay bright green. Now, we haven't got any application of that to how long it would be in the flood before they were buried or anything, but there are definitely other factors to fossilization than just bury it and preserve it. Now, what we've just done is I spent the last 2,000 kilometers going backwards and forwards through New South Wales, and one of the things we did was we were asked to do a homeschooling conference. So as we went down, we observed things, we recorded them for sharing at the conference in the churches. As we came back, we recorded more things and shared them with the various groups. And the last thing we did was we took a bunch of homeschoolers and we actually said, let's have an experimental day. So we made some fossils. We made all sorts of interesting things. In fact, it was Jurassic Ark almost in a classroom, Jurassic Ark not on 10 hectares out in the open, Jurassic Ark in a teacup, Jurassic Ark where we took the things that normally take big fancy equipment and we turned it into classroom size. You could do it in a glass bottle. So enjoy the trip for the last part, and then we'll have a last time of questions. Get your questions ready and enjoy. And if you want to know how we've done that, then keep watching. Now, Sam, you're going to have to guide me through again, because this incompetent person never is memorable enough to having grown up without computers to get this right. So what's my first step, Sam?
Okie dokie. So you've got Restream up, I'm guessing?
Yeah.
Okay, so what you want to do is you want to hover down on your lower bar at the bottom where it has the PowerPoint. You want to hover over it. Don't click anything. There should be two windows that pop up. You want to click on your full screen PowerPoint presentation.
Is that right?
And then you should be able to click through it.
Okay, have we showed up?
We have showed up. Just
good,
try
so
clicking.
I can. Okay, is that there?
There we go. There.
Yeah.
Oh.
Good. Look at that, in one step, with brilliant advice from Sam, who grew up with computers all his life. Well, one thing we've done for homeschoolers, we've got a couple of new books on the horizon. Didn't Know I'd Take Me on the Ark. Great fun for little kids. And that new one, a brand new venture from Creation Research, a Jurassic Ark dinosaur and colouring book. And forgive me for stressing it, but the evidence for design is evident in anything, including dinosaur colouring books. Jurassic Ark, that word was deliberately invented We created it. So anyone who says they can't understand the evidence of creation is blind. They're not looking at what's around them, whether it's Jurassic Ark in English code or whether it's DNA in genetic code. Okay, on the way down, we stopped at this place. Look at that rock. It's dirty, grey looking, mucky stuff. Beautiful scene with 5 islands in the distance, ocean waves, etc. Of course, what's interesting is, do you see the nice chiastic crystal there in the form of a cross? Yep, that's a twinned crystal. So I love collecting things like this. We were down at Bass Point in Australia, and it's a rather famous tourist site, and they've got these little signs down there, and there's lots of people wandering around. It's fairly relaxed, but this place here is an indigenous cultural walk. The Aborigines were here long before the Europeans. And in fact, they like to tell you that the scene you could see is actually a modern scene, because back 17,000 years ago on their chronology, the water was 14 kilometers further out to sea. So you're worried about the ocean rising? I'm sorry, but the evidence here is that it's risen an awful lot more than the couple of millimeters that the satellites report happening over the past 20 or 30 years. Okay, so big evidence of massive sea level rises while the Aborigines were here. Some of their stories tell you the sea came in so fast, it basically they had to run to get away from it. And what you find at that point, their current use, the use they were using it for just before the Europeans arrived, was as a dump. That's a midden, regarded as culturally significant today, but it's really an Aboriginal rubbish heap. You can sometimes find interesting things in it, what they used for hooks and things like that, but it's really where they sat down on the beach, ate their seashell, broke open a new one, and then tossed the rubbish away. Well, there's the pretty view. Can you imagine seeing 14 kilometers more of sea? Well, you wouldn't have seen the ocean there at all. And that probably would have been a slightly different forestry area. So number one, on this trip, plenty of evidence the sea level change has been massive in the not too distant past, even on the evolutionist system. Secondly, I was on this trip, I'd been invited to our first church camp that people have organised since the COVID rules were relaxed. What are we looking at? Well, there's a sign that somebody put up there because it's a fact of history in this area. Now, beautiful area. See the valley that we're heading down to? See the hill on the other side? You can see this sign is fairly high. And on it is a date, 1870, because that's where the flood water reached in 1870. You see water level changes. Isn't there a lot of phobia in Australia about the water, the weather's gone mad? There are floods everywhere. Well, I'm sorry, but the last time the floods were this bad was not 1870, it was 1950. I know, I was alive back in those days. And I've seen it bad from, well, not from 1870, but from 1950s. I've lived through quite a few floods. But there it is in 1870. There's the sign. Now, do you see the water came right up the hill? Let's look down now to a little pumping house area there. And can you see the river way back in the distance beside the next hill? Well, there it is over there. What you find is in 1870, this flood was enormous. There is nothing new under the sun. And forgive my skepticism of all the climate change gurus, but they are ignoring real history. You see, they tell you this is the worst recorded flooding in history. What they mean is since changes were actually recorded by the Weather Bureau. Little wooden signs up a hill in the valleys beyond Sydney don't count. They should. That's what we were going to teach at this camp. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And behold, creation research does not apologize. Our job is to convince you to think like Jesus, because he never makes mistakes. Learn from his word, because it's not full of any errors. Learn from what he said, because he was there when Noah's flood, the biggest water level change, actually happened in history. What were we talking about? There's been lots of jokes on the internet lately, dating in 2022. So, have you always been a woman? Have you noticed the woke concepts of gender and all of that are really prominent at the moment. The church asked me to deal with woke. How do Christians deal with woke philosophy? And some Christians said, woke, what do you mean? Well, there's part of it. Just go to the web. How cartoons have helped my child understand LGBTQ and all the other letters that are popping up on it. And it's certainly true. The people who fund this have been using cartoons to get their message across to kids. And of course, it's showing up in the press. If you live in Australia, you will have noticed this one, a big argument about women's netball and the only Indigenous player, and that raised it even higher stakes. There's the Australian, our national daily. No gratitude shown as woke come between the green and the gold. One of our famous mining owners out here, Gina, whose father established a huge mining corporation, actually said some rather not so nice things about Aboriginals when he was alive. Now the Aboriginal player refuses to actually wear Gina's lovely symbol on their women's netball uniforms. So they turned down a 25 million donation from the mining company. Well, one of the Aboriginal politicians said that if you make your bed, you lie in it. Unless you netballers have got a few cool million in your back pocket to support your sporting code, your woke sense of self-importance should be your private opinion, and hold it to yourself. Now, that lady is an Aboriginal. So despite the fact the press is promoting this Aboriginal victimisation, I'm sorry, but the Aboriginal politician, she says, no, keep your thoughts to yourself about this stuff. So the Christian said, how do we deal with all this woke? Oh, we had some unregistered attendees at the camp that had a bit of variety, and they certainly weren't woke. You want to know what woke means? Well, we might do a whole program on that if we can find a way to not get banned. You'll find it's interesting. Oh, these are Aussie wombats. Definitely not woke. Definitely the boys are boys and the girls are girls, and no trannies at all. So what you find is Australia has an interesting question like, how come we've got wombats and you don't? All really good questions, but are you willing to let this mind be in you that was also in Christ Jesus? Is it relevant to the fact that they couldn't have survived the flood by swimming, so Noah had to have them on board? So perhaps the only reason they're in Australia is that if there's only 3 pairs, you can't go in every possible direction. So they headed to Australia and got cut off. Would you be willing to even think about that? Let this mind be in you from creation all the way through to the coming again of Jesus Christ. Because central to the whole Bible teaching is Christ, the Creator, Christ the Lord, Christ the Redeemer, Christ the coming Judge. So we finally got, as our last possible venture, to the homeschoolers. And I said, let's do some experiments. So look, we made up some glass jars. One of the mums supplied the jars and the water and the matches. What were we doing? How do matches sink? Now you might think that's a silly question, but you only get the answers to the questions that you ask. You see, we've first of all removed the danger level. We burnt the matches. Yeah, kids will burn anything down if you give them half an opportunity. And so these are dead matches, and they've been put on top in the water, and some of them sink and some of them float. This was an 18-hour-old experiment. And there's the box. We split them up into groups of 3 or 4, and all had different age groups. They all had different experiments. Oh, look at the one on the left-hand side. Some of the matches are only just floating and just sinking. It seems they sink vertically. Why would that be? That's what they have to sort out. You see, there's a learning episode because there was one of the mums who acted as our photographer. And I put my one finger down and I showed them, look, this one's 2/3 sunk. It hasn't hit the bottom, but it's no longer at the top. It seems that matchsticks sink vertically, or they float horizontally, but they sink vertically. Why the finger? I said, well, we have to know which photograph this is. So this was photograph number 1. Test everything. Only keep the things that are true. How can you decide what's true? You have to keep records. Hence you read in Genesis, this is the written record of Noah. This is the written record of Adam. This is the history. So Genesis doesn't claim to be just an opinion. Genesis claims to be a record. Just like that, we recorded the first bottle. And the boys have to then check, and the older students hang around the back till their time comes to do one of their experiments. The relevance? You see, we have Jurassic Ark, a much bigger thing of water, and we put the sticks in it, not matches this time, but big enough for everybody to see, and they all float horizontally. They're all off bits of trees, and look, they all horizontally float. But within a day or two, like the matches, they start to sink. Because they're bigger, you can actually see some of them floating horizontally still, some of them sinking vertically, and some that are lying semi-vertical, and some that have reached the bottom. Well, there we are closer up. Jurassic Ark test tank, polystrate test tank. Because what happens in the end is they will all hit the bottom, and then they will all gradually tip over, then they will all fall down and go horizontal. What happens if you bury them before that? Well, that's what happens. You see, the relevance of answering how do matchsticks float is you come up with a wonderful view of polystrate trees. Polystrate trees, well, trees are where we get matchsticks from. You take a big pine tree, cut it into, elongate little matchsticks, and then you put some phosphorus and wax on the end, and then you can use a matchstick. But if you burn the match, you will find that it still behaves as a tree does. One end gets wet before the other does and forms a polystrate tree. There's John Mackay. If the polystrate tree lands, it can still absorb minerals and eventually will fill up with minerals like iron. Simple little experiment in a bottle, done in a homeschooling classroom. That's all you need. You don't need 10 hectares of land to do this on. You don't need vast amounts of equipment. You homeschoolers out there, run some experiments. Set up the bottles the day before, put the water and the matches in, and then on the day you're doing the experiment, set the kids up themselves so they can see what you've done and see your results, and then start to do it again and take the bottles home, or the plastic bottles, just for safety. Not time, but process. Forgive me for being boring, but when God made the world in 6 days, he didn't need time because he had the right process. In fact, to be blunt, he didn't even need 6 days. He took 6 days to teach us something. He took 6 days for our sake, so that on the 7th day, he would rest. Yes, you see, it's all built into the fact that the whole creation points to Christ. Why did he need to rest on the 7th day? Because he never broke any of his own rules. And when you saw that he rose from the dead on the 8th day, wow, I'll tell you what. That's another whole lesson. Look up our video on the 6 days of creation, and you'll learn why God deliberately made the world in 6 days, but he won't remake it in 6 days at all. Test all things. Hold fast that which is good. A simple little experiment with matches, and homeschoolers can learn an awful lot of Bible teaching. What else? Here's me with another group. You see, there's all different ages there that day, and I'm obviously the oldest one. You can tell that because what used to be in my hair has gone, and the kids were fascinated by that, particularly the girl on the right-hand side. When she first met me, she said, "Wow, you're different." She hasn't seen me for quite a long time. I said, "What do you mean different?" She said, "Your hair's missing." I said, "Well, what's the importance of that?" "Wow, it means every time I see you now, you look different." She thought that was interesting. But look at the white plastic cartons in front. We've actually made up some concrete. Yep, ordinary concrete. And we wanted to show them that the chemicals that are in the ocean actually make rocks go hard much quicker, right? So what we've done, we've got salt. You can see the 2 cartons of salt. And in the ones on the left-hand side, we've made up the concrete, and we mixed 2 heaped teaspoons. And then the ones in the middle, we've actually mixed 1 big heaped teaspoon. And in the one on the left-hand side, we've actually put only a half, a level teaspoon. Do you know what happened? Beware of false signs that lead you astray. Now that's a good verse, but you see what happened was all of the ones on the right-hand side, actually, when you stir in 2 heaped teaspoons of salt, it just goes all runny. When you stir in 1, it doesn't set solid. But the one on the left-hand side, when you put half a teaspoon in a full cup of cement mix, it goes thunk. But then again, when you put 3% of salt in a well, I learned this from a well digger who said we have to set the concrete real fast. So we use 3% salt and it sets in under 3 minutes. Why did he do that? Because if you're drilling down a big hole and lining it with cement, you can't let it go soft. You can't leave it there for 24 hours like normal. He said, we discovered that 3% salt would set it real fast. 3%, that's what you find in seawater. So any of the limey materials that normally would take ages to set in Noah's flood with that 3% salt, you learn that the millions of years is false science. It can't even make fast concrete. The 3% salt makes a whole world of difference. Oh, and one of the other things we did, I got one of the boys to go down his swamp and dig up some beautiful clay. Yep, really good clay. And of course, we're making clay balls. And we've got some leaves. Clay, well, most of the clay in Australia has got real good amounts of kaolinite. If you have a pure kaolinite deposit, it's bright white. But this one was good enough. And what we were doing was making fossils. There's the leaves, bright green to start with. And of course, there's a finished product. What's he done? He's actually taken the ball of clay, banged it out. Oh, you can see what we have underneath it, a nice plastic, very thick, you call it a tarpaulin, but it's really a clay preventer. Keep the clay and the concrete and in case we spilt the water, keep it all on the table, but not on the wood. And then we had another huge tarpaulin underneath the table so that it was really kid-proof. It didn't matter if they dropped some plaster. It didn't matter if they spilt some water because we could mop it up very easily. So those of you listening, if you want to do this inside, safest and coolest place to do it, particularly in Australia, make sure you take kid proofing. Otherwise, you might get an insurance bill from the building's owner. Well, he's put his leaves inside, he's marked it, and look what happens next. One of the mums offered to bring along her vacuum packer, and she's putting the plastic bag around the pile of clay and then drawing all the air out of it and sealing it. There's what he's taking home. And I'll guarantee within a week or two, which we told them to then open it up, here's what they'll find. Same as we did. Here's our fossil. Well, it's a pre-fossil. You can see the nice white kaolin clay. And there's one we started on the 24th of the 1st in 2020. 2 weeks later, we open it up. Look what it is. Nice black carbonized. Now, it's not just carbonized. We proved it was a fossil and the leaves were now coal. Yes, there's the original and there's what it was just 2 weeks later. You can make your own fossil. You don't need time. You need the right process. The kaolinite seems to act as a catalyst, but the kids don't even need to understand words like that. They just need to have fun bashing up clay, stuffing leaves inside it, and then learning how to make coal quickly. Well, one last little bit before we go any further. We've made that point many, many times. False knowledge leads you away from Christ. True knowledge points you to Christ. They won't convert you to Christianity, but they'll say, signpost, signpost, all points to Jesus. That's what the Bible says about the whole of creation. You see, the last experiment we got them to do was take mushes of leaves and grass. Okay, there we are. Mix it with clay, just in this case, a smidgen of clay. And within a short period of time, what you find is whether it's animals or plants, the bags swell up and you can put the bag inside a safety device. You see our can underwater? You put the bag, expanded bag, and then you burst the bag and you set fire to the gas that comes out. This produces absolutely odorless methane. Beautiful. Oh, we thought the world would love to hear about this, but in reality, the greenies have despised us because we proved that methane is easy to regenerate. We proved that coal is not a finalized stuff. You can actually make this, and you don't need millions of years. You actually can make it out of recycling plants, recycling materials. It's a regenerative fuel. Oh, and there's one last thing those of you out there might be interested in. we have been turning this into a potentially industrial technique. I was surprised. I thought geologists and that would really grab a hold of this, but they actually turned it down because they don't like the concept that their millions of years is fake. You don't need vast ages to make coal. You can make it in a couple of weeks. And yes, we sent it to professors, and what we made was coal. Yes, this is methane, and it's odorless. Wow. Now, you might want to get behind what we're doing. I'd encourage you. That's not a cheap little plastic cup. That's not a cheap little tin can. That's a fairly expensive set of elaborate equipment to do this. If you want to donate in Australia, we now tell you, after quite a few conflicts with our bank pay, etc., you can now use our pay ID simply by memorising that phone number. +61, then the dash 488 098 130. Quite amazing how you can donate today. You can use PayPal, you can use all sorts of things, but that's the latest, and it's a very, very easy way. Takes you straight to our ministry account if you want to get involved. Or you can ask us how you might want to invest in this, because we're getting to the stage where our research, creation research, is leading to industrial type processes. Okay, Sam, put me back on. Then we've got time for a couple of minutes questions before the morning has gone. Morning in Australia.
Yes, exactly. Right, I'll take off your PowerPoint. Do you want instructions as to how to come back to us, or are you okay?
Yeah, I think I'm right. I go to there we are. Okay, that's you, correct?
There we go.
Yep. Look at that, all by myself.
Oh, all by yourself. I'm so proud of you, John. Look at that. Right, okay, so let's have a look at some messages. So we've got this one coming from Neil. He says, if you did the match demonstration and when the match is floating, you add minerals, would you end up with a polystrate match?
You don't need the actual minerals to make it polystrate. It will start out floating horizontally because none of it has absorbed water. All you have in it is the manufacturer's dried out piece of pine, and it's got the burnt phosphorus head on one end. So it floats horizontally. And then what you find is, because it's part of a tree, I mean, you took the tree like this, you chopped the pine tree, you split it up into tiny little splints like that, and one end was the bottom of the tree, the other end was the top. Right, this is in the tree itself where it's cut from. So it naturally absorbs water by the roots pumping water up the tree. We don't know why it happens, but when the tree is alive, it's a brilliant pump. But when it's dead, it still pumps water up the top. We don't know how. So you take a section and put it in water, and you do this with a rose stem. You cut the rose, put it in a vase of water, because for weeks it will soak the water up. You can prove that by putting red dye in and turn a white rose red. So you know it's working even when it's cut off from the tree. So what you'll find is trees do this naturally. So you've got your horizontal match, and it will start soaking water in from one end, and that end will become more and more waterlogged. And then as it sinks, the water is going further up the stem. Of course, if there are minerals in it, the minerals will get in there as well. But we deliberately use pure water, and it will sink right to the bottom. Now, when it's got to the bottom, by the time the water is evenly all the way up, it will start to go over like this, and then it will finally end up like that when it's totally waterlogged all along. Now, you don't need to add minerals. You can if you wish, but the minerals will add even when it's sitting horizontally on the bottom or vertically or inclined. So they'll all end up with minerals after they have reached the bottom. So it's worth doing the experiment just to show that, but you don't need the minerals to make it sink.
Right, awesome. Thank you so much. We've got one last question here. I see what you did with your name. I'm not going to read that out. I'll say Puck Bill Gates. Is there any evidence of spontaneous biogenesis from non-living matter? Seems to me that if evolution doesn't happen at that level, then it doesn't happen no matter how much time you give it.
Okay, Diane, do you want to comment on that first? Then I'll give us our final comment for the day.
Well, maybe we could do that. Maybe that could be one of our future topics, the origin of life. But very, very briefly, the short answer is yes, you do understand the problem. In fact, I once heard a lawyer giving a lecture at a creation conference, and he spoke after someone had just explained how the origin of life couldn't happen from chemicals. And he said he's just blown the whole thing out of the water, because if you have a series of events where the first event has to happen, then the second event is dependent on the one that went before, and so on, so that you have a series of events. If you can prove that the first one didn't happen, the rest of it didn't happen. That's the end of the story. So that's a very good point you've made. Going back to any evidence that living matter can occur from non-living matter, no, there's no evidence for that whatsoever. There are a whole lot of experiments which we could possibly explain in a topic on the origin of life, where people have tried to make organic molecules, in other words, the molecules that you find in living cells, out of simple molecules that you find out in the normal environment, out in the dirt and the water and the sea. And they have failed every time to make the particular organic molecules that you need for life. And one of the most important thing is that a lot of organic molecules come in two slightly different shapes. They are called left and right-handed, and that's actually a good analogy in terms of your left and your right hand have the same structure, but they are not identical. They're mirror images of one another. And so you do have molecules that are mirror images of one another. Chemically, they behave the same because they're made out of the same atoms in the same configuration. They're just a mirror image of one another. But in living things, you have one side or the other side of the mirror image molecules. And that's one of the most important distinctions between molecules in living things and molecules found out in the environment. And so far, all of the efforts to separate organic molecules into just one-sided molecules have involved a lot of creative design. In fact, so much creative design that about 20 years ago, 3 scientists won a Nobel Prize for being able to do it. So that didn't happen by chance. But that's a very good question, and I think we should go further with that one.
Yeah, just for those of you who go online with us, we have dealt with this. Diane and I did a course quite a few years ago called Search for the Origin of Life, and I did that in a school and filmed it for this is a state school, a government school, for 5 days, 6 days courses, something like that, and they filmed it. I was very grateful they permitted that to be filmed. Cost us a fair bit to do, but you'll find the videos of that are still online. So if you want to stream it, it's available. So that's Search for the Origin of Life. Sam put up our streaming site or our website where they can find those things. Search for the Origin of Life, and it deals with this whole issue and shows you, well, it really is an analogy. When you wanted to go on a date, you want to borrow Dad's car, you get outside and you find that he's left the keys at work deliberately, so you can't borrow the car. You ain't going anywhere, right? That's evolution. You've got all the ingredients, but nothing is going to work for you because it doesn't require time. It requires a process. And Jesus Christ, the Creator, is the only one who can provide the chemicals that make the flour hot at the same time as the water is cool, at the same time as the plant needs to breathe on the top, not the bottom, or it'll drown itself, etc., etc. So he's that clever. He thinks of all those options, including you and I and the way we work. So give him the praise that's due to his name, Sam. I think we can pull the plug now and say goodbye till next week when we have our whole team for the first time in maybe 5 weeks.
Yes, indeed. It's been far too long since we're all together under one stream, as it were, as opposed to under one roof. But thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you in the chat. As messages from me, please subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help us out, and hit that notification bell so you're notified of every single time that we do a Creation Conversations or upload a new video. Joe mentioned earlier that there will be a video available on Creation Research shortly of the full high quality version of his movie earlier. Thank you so much for joining, and we will see you next time. Bye bye.
Yes, goodbye. All the best.
Bye bye.